quiz you because I have a great tutoring session for the unit circle.
Okay.
Let me ask you, do you know what the tangent of 225 is?
Um,
Right off, without a calculator.
yeah, that's the stuff I'm kind of having, like, hard times on, I guess. I'm still kind of
Okay,
confused on that.
okay, good. I'll try to give you a half-hour session. Everything starts out with this. Everything that I'm going to end up writing on my screen, I want you to memorize.
Okay.
I will not write anything on here that you don't need to memorize. SOHCAHTOA and these two triangles are where trig starts.
Okay.
These two right triangles. Now, what's important is the dimensions. Do you know what the dimensions of the 30-60 special triangle is? It's opposite the 30. I actually call these my unit special triangles, like the unit circle. And the reason
Okay.
I call them that is because the side opposite the smallest angle is always 1. So that's
Okay.
1. Okay?
Okay, yes.
This is square root of 3. That's 2. On this
Okay.
triangle, that's 1. That's 1. That's square root of 2. So,
Okay.
between those two triangles, you can figure out most of the angles in the first quadrant that they want you to memorize, right?
Okay.
In other words, I know that ultimately they're going to give you a big unit circle, they're going to slice it up 16 times, and they want you to know all 6 trig functions at all 16 slices. So
Okay.
they're asking you to memorize 96 things. Well, nobody memorizes 96 things very well.
No.
The secret to memorizing those 96 things is to memorize stuff in groups of 3 and 4 and then figuring out what each of the 96 things is instead of memorizing it.
Okay.
Okay? So, based on these two triangles, what's the sine of 30 degrees?
The sine of 30 degrees is 1, correct?
1 over 2. Remember
Oh,
that
1 over.
you're always taking trig functions of angles to produce ratios. Always
Okay.
think of it like that. Your ratio may end up being 2 over 1 or 1 over 1, which turns into a number, but in general, your trig functions always produce ratios. That's what
Okay.
SOHCAHTOA means, is sine is opposite over hypotenuse. That's a ratio. Cosine
Okay.
is adjacent over hypotenuse. What's the cosine of 30 degrees?
The cosine is uh square root of 3 over 2.
What's the tangent of 45 degrees?
It's 1 over 1. So just 1.
Good. Do you know your reciprocal functions?
It's cosecant, secant, and cotangent.
Okay, let's start with the 3. What kind of calculator do you use, Peyton? Is it a TI-84 or an Inspire?
It's an Inspire.
Okay, the Inspire actually will have a button for each of the 6 trig functions.
Yeah, I kind of saw. Yeah, I saw that.
But you still need to know the reciprocals. In other words, if you were using a TI-84, they don't even have secant, cosecant, and cotangent on there. The way
No.
you get it is to know that cosecant is the reciprocal of sine. But let's talk
Yeah.
about memorizing this. Trig is all about memorization. Okay? You're
Yeah.
going to have to memorize more stuff in trig than all of the math you've taken up until now,
Okay.
believe it or not. So the reciprocal of tangent, pretty easy to remember, cotangent.
Yeah.
Okay? And there's always an x here. Sometimes I don't write it just because I get tired of writing the angle all the time. But saying just sine doesn't mean anything. In other words,
Okay.
you have to have an angle there. Same with
Okay.
all 6 trig functions. Now, once you've figured out that tangent is reciprocal of cotangent, the only thing you need to figure out is, does the secant go with the sine or does the cosecant go with the sine? Well,
Okay.
it's the cosecant because C is different than S.
Yeah.
And the secant goes with the cosine because C is different than S. In other words, if I were to get these mixed up and think that sine x was equal to 1 over secant, I got S and S. I know that's not right.
Okay. Yeah.
All you have to do is,
I was a little confused on that part.
all you have to do is memorize that the first letters are different.
Okay.
It's coincidental that they're both C and S, but
Yeah.
they're different. That's the key. Okay? So
Okay.
you need to know these 6 reciprocals. And if these are true, then it's also true that the cosecant of x is equal to 1 over the sine. In other words, there's actually 6 reciprocal identities that you have to
Yeah.
know, but you really don't have to memorize these second 3. You can always figure those out.
Yeah.
And that's another secret to trig, is don't necessarily memorize everything you have to know. Memorize the minimum amount that you have to know if you can figure out other stuff.
Okay.
Okay? Now, so those are your 6 reciprocals that you do have to know. Now let's talk
Okay.
about the unit circle.
Yeah, I had a little bit of better luck with the unit circle. I know it a little bit better, but I guess we could just go over that again.
Well, in order to be able to answer my original question, what's the tangent of 225? You need the unit circle. Because
Yeah.
these 2 triangles are only going to give you the trig functions for the first quadrant.
Yeah.
Notice that you can figure out 30, 45, and 60, and that's it. So
Yeah.
you can figure out that angle, you can figure out that angle, and you can figure out that angle. But
Yeah.
if I give you an angle that's outside of the first quadrant, and I gave you one that was in the third quadrant,
Yeah.
then you've got to use some conversions. Okay?
Oh, okay.
Here's what they are. In the second quadrant, you want to take 180 minus theta. In the third quadrant, you want to take theta minus 180. And in the fourth
Okay.
quadrant, you want to take 360 minus theta. What do I mean
Okay.
by that? I meant that, well, the angle I gave you was tangent of 225, right?
Yeah.
So you can tell that, first of all, identify which quadrant it's in. It's in the third quadrant.
Yeah.
Then substitute it for theta, and you get an equivalent first quadrant angle of 45.
Okay.
Well, the numerical value for the tangent of 225, or I should say the absolute value, is the same as the absolute value of the tangent of 45. Well, we can see the tangent of 45 from these triangles is 1.
Yeah.
Now is all I need to do is figure out its plus or minus sign. And here's
Okay.
something else. They may have taught you this, they may not. All students take calculus. Have they taught you that?
No, they haven't.
Okay, what this means is that in the first quadrant, all 6 trig functions are positive.
Okay.
In the second quadrant, only sine and its reciprocal is positive. Only.
Okay.
So sine and cosecant. In the third quadrant, only tangent and its reciprocal, cotangent, are positive.
Yeah.
And in the fourth quadrant, only cosine is positive. And of course,
Okay.
if cosine's positive, its reciprocal has to be positive also.
Okay.
So to figure out the sign that goes with this number 1, we see that it's in the third quadrant, tangent's positive, that's a +1. So the tangent
Okay.
of 225 is actually the same result as the tangent of 45. Not always true. Let me give you some others. Tell me what the sine of 150 is. And I would like you to learn this technique that I use. It's so easy. You never have to memorize anything more than 3 things at a time. Notice there's only 3 things in each of these triangles you have to remember. The dimensions. And in fact, if you remember that they're unit triangles, there's really only 2 things in each triangle. You know the side opposite the smallest angle is always 1, so you have to remember the √3 and the 2. And in this triangle, you just have to remember the √2.
Okay.
And in the unit circle, you have to remember 180 minus theta for the second quadrant, theta minus 180 for the third, 360 minus theta for the fourth. That's 3 things.
Okay.
And then you have to remember all students take calculus. That's 4 things.
Yeah.
Between everything you're looking at on the left side of my screen, you can figure out the trig function of every single angle that is a multiple of 30 or 45 degrees. For instance, do the sine of 150. What's that going to be the equivalent of? What's its equivalent? And they'll sometimes call this the reference angle. You've probably been taught the reference angle.
Is that when you like add 360 to the?
Let me draw 150. First of all, you measure it clockwise, counterclockwise. So the 150-degree angle is that angle right there.
Yeah.
And the reference angle is always the angle that's made with the x-axis. And it turns out to always be the same as, that gives you the same number as the first quadrant angle. So you don't really need to use this concept of reference angle, even though they teach it. Because all you need is this 180 minus theta. Well, 180 minus 150 is 30.
Yeah.
Well, that's because the reference angle here is always going to be supplementary to the main angle. So that's why in the second quadrant, the formula is 180 minus theta. Well, what's the sine of 30? What's value?
It's square root of 3 over
sine of 30, opposite over hypotenuse.
Oh, it's 1 over 2.
Okay. And I always do it this way. I figure out the number part first, then I figure out its plus or minus sign. What is the plus or minus sign on the sine function in the second quadrant? All students take calculus. The S means that sine and only sine and its reciprocal are positive in the second quadrant. Well, we're in the second quadrant, so that's a plus 1/2. Okay. Now, I'm going to make it a little different. 2 examples I've given you, the result was the same as the equivalent first quadrant. What if I say, what's the cosine of 240? What?
Well, that would be in that'd be in the third quadrant. So
what's its equivalent first quadrant angle?
Would that be
use the theta minus 180.
That would be hold on,
plug in 240 for theta.
It's going to be 60.
Okay. Now give me the numerical value for the cosine of 60 by looking at this triangle up here.
It's going to be 1 over 2.
Okay. Now attach a plus or minus sign to it. We're in the third quadrant.
Well, if it's cosine, it would be a negative.
That's the way you do these. Every single one of them is that simple.
Okay.
Okay? Now let me just test you with a few. Give me the tangent of 315. And I like to use this pattern and method every single time. Don't skip a step. Figure out its equivalent first quadrant angle, also referred to as the reference angle.
Well, its equivalent would be 135.
Now hold on. You got to use, you're in the fourth quadrant, first of
Oh
all.
yeah, yeah, it would be
So you got to use that formula.
it would be 45.
Okay, what's the tangent of 45 from your triangle?
The tangent is going to be 1 over 1.
And what is its plus or minus sign in the fourth quadrant?
Yeah, if it's in the fourth quadrant and it's tangent, it would be negative.
That's it. That's how you do every one of these problems.
Okay, yeah, that's starting to make sense now.
That allows you to complete every slice of the unit circle except the quadrangles.
The quadrangles?
The quadrangles are multiples of 90. In other words,
Okay.
if I said, what's the sine of 90? You can't really figure it out from these two triangles. I mean, you can, but it's almost a limit problem, a calculus problem. And that's not the way to do it anyway. Let me show you how to do it. First of all, I'm going to draw the unit circle. And it's called the unit circle because the radius is always 1. No matter which quadrant you're in, it's always positive 1.
Okay.
The circle is your first exposure to polar coordinates. Okay? If I want the coordinates of that point right there, x comma y, notice if I look at that little triangle that I've drawn, I can say that the cosine of theta equals the adjacent, which is the x-coordinate, over the hypotenuse, which is 1, which means cosine of theta is always the x-coordinate. And if I said, what's the sine of theta? It would be the y measurement over 1. So the sine of theta is always y. Okay. Now, when they give you this unit circle with 16 slices in it, they actually want you to put the coordinates on there. In other words, if they say, let's look at the 30-degree angle, they not only need to know what cosine of 30 is and sine of 30, but you need to know the coordinates on that point. And the coordinates on that point are cosine of theta, or 30, sine of 30. Well, cosine of 30 is root 3 over 2. Yeah. Sine of 30 is 1/2. So the coordinates on that point are root 3 over 2. The x-coordinate is always the cosine of the angle. The y-coordinate is always the sine of the angle. Okay. Now, what this does is it allows you to figure out the quadrangles really easy. Let's take a 0-degree angle. Well, a 0-degree angle is just a straight line, right? Measured counterclockwise from the x-axis. Well, what are the coordinates on that point right there if this is a unit circle?
It's just going to be 0 or 1, 0.
Okay. And I know the first coordinate is the cosine of theta. Yeah. So what's the cosine of 0 degrees?
Well, wouldn't that just be? Isn't that just going to be 1?
You got it. What's the sine of 0 degrees?
Isn't that also going to be 1?
Oh, the sine is the y coordinate.
Oh, okay. That would be like, wouldn't that be 0?
You got it. Now let's look at 90 degrees. An angle of
That's
90 degrees.
going to be 0, 1.
Coordinates on that? 0, comma 1. So now tell me what the cosine of 90 degrees is.
The cosine's going to be 0, and the sine's going to be 1.
Okay. Now let's look at a 180 degree angle. This angle right there. Coordinates on that point or what?
Negative 1, 0.
What's the cosine of 180 degrees?
Negative 1.
The sine of 180 degrees?
Going to be 0.
And finally, we'll take the 270 coordinates on that point.
0, negative 1.
What's the cosine of 270?
That's going to be the cosine's going to be 1, negative 1, and then the sine's going to be.
Hold on. Cosine's always the x coordinate.
Oh yeah, the cosine's going to be 0, or.
And the sine of 270?
It's going to be negative 1.
Okay. You now have enough information to complete the unit circle.
Yeah.
Seriously. In 20 minutes, everything you see on this page, let me erase some of this that you don't need. If you memorize everything that's on this page, and I wish I could have fit it all on one page because I would say pull out your camera and take a picture of it.
Yeah.
Because this will allow you to figure out all 6 trig functions of all 16 spots of the unit circle. And really the only ones you really need are the sine and the cosine, right? Because
Yeah.
they actually want you to put the x and y coordinates of each of the end point of each of these rays for 30, 45, 60, 90, 120, 135, 150, 180. They want the x and y coordinates of that. So
Yeah.
the only thing you need to know is the x coordinate is always cosine of theta, the y coordinate is always sine of theta, and that also allows you now to figure out the quadrangles. 90, 90, 180, 270, and 360. Or 0,
Okay.
90, 180, and so forth and so on.
Yeah.
There you have it. There is all you need to do the unit circle. In other words,
Yeah.
you can recreate this page from blank, from scratch. And here, I need this unit circle, but I don't really. I wouldn't even put that in there as something to memorize, that part right there.
Okay.
As long as you know that the x coordinate is cosine and the y coordinate is sine. In other words, as long as you know these two things over here, then you'll always be able to figure it out. What you have to memorize is this 180 minus theta, this theta minus 180, and this 360 minus theta in each of those quadrants. And you have to memorize A, S, T, C counterclockwise, going from 1 to 4. You have to memorize these two triangles. That's it.
Oh yeah, that's.
You don't even need this lower circle on the right. You can always figure that out on your own.
Okay.
You know, you didn't have any problems coming up with the x and y coordinates at each of those quadrangles.
No.
As long as you know the x coordinate is cosine of theta, then you know what the cosine of each of the quadrangles is.
Okay.
What's the cosine of 450?
The cosine of 450. That's going to be Well, that's in the first quadrant,
Well,
right?
it's a quadrangle. In other words, you want to take away as many 360s as you can get. So this is exactly the same as the cosine of 90.
Yeah.
Well, what's cosine of 90?
Cosine of 90 is 1.
No.
Or no, it's going to be 0. And
Yeah,
then the
that's
sine
an
is,
easy mistake to make. Everybody seems to
yeah.
think sine should be first and cosine should be second.
Yeah.
It's not. Cosine is first, sine is second.
Okay.
Okay?
Cool.
So whenever you get, now you're able to figure out any angle, whether it's in the unit circle or not. In other words,
Okay.
as long as you subtract, if I would have given you the sine of 750, well now you, or the cosine of 750, now you want to take away 720 to get it.
Yeah.
You got to get it into the unit circle. You got to get it between an angle between 0 and 360.
Yeah.
Okay, so I would subtract 720. That's the same as the cosine of 30
Yeah.
is root 3 over 2.
Okay.
Okay, and that covers everything but negative angles. We're kind of out of time, but negative angles can always be converted to positive angles, and you can always go that route. That isn't necessarily the most efficient way to go. There's actually a little bit more, once you learn a little bit more trig, there's an easier, slightly easier way to do negative angles, but
Okay.
you can always do them by converting them to a positive angle. In other words, minus 100 degrees is the same as plus 260, right?
Yeah.
In other words, they're coterminal with one another. Coterminal means they're separated by multiples of 360.
Okay.
Okay? But if you took a photograph of just this page and made sure you memorized it, you're going to be able to completely fill out all 96 slots on the unit circle. Now, I've showed you how to get sine and cosine. Well, you know how to get tangent from just reading it off of these.
Yeah.
Tangent of the quadrangles, just remember that tangent equals sine divided by cosine.
Okay.
That's an important identity that you have to know. Well, you know the sines and the cosines, so now you know the tangent.
Yeah.
In other words, if I said, what's the tangent of 90 degrees? What is it?
The tangent, like the tangent of 90 degrees is, well, that would be
Figure out what sine divided by cosine is.
well, that would
Undefined.
that would be one divided. That would be 1 divided by 0. So would that just be, that would be 0, right?
Undefined. No, you cannot divide
Oh,
by 0. You can divide
oh,
into 0. In other words, the
yeah.
cotangent of 90 degrees is cosine over sine, which would be 0 divided by 1. That's 0.
Okay.
1 divided by 0, whenever you divide anything by 0, you're going to get undefined as an answer.
Okay.
And that shows up as a vertical asymptote on the graph. But
Okay.
that's the way you can do tangents of angles greater than 30, 45, or 60. For all the angles that are in the first quadrant, you can just use these two triangles and SOHCAHTOA and these reciprocals over here to figure out what they are. But when if you're talking tangent of 150, well, you can still convert the 150 to a tangent of 30 and still use these two triangles. So you don't actually need this identity here except for the quadrangles, maybe.
Okay.
There's no easy way to figure out the tangent of the quadrangles except by knowing it's sine divided by cosine.
Okay.
Okay? All right.
All right. Thanks.
You're welcome. That should help a lot. Make sure,
it does.
make sure you don't forget this. This is kind of the basis of all trig.
Okay.
They always want you to know these angles that are multiples of 30, 45, or 60. They want you to know them without a calculator.
Okay.
They'll never want you to know the sine of 20 degrees without a calculator. Only multiples of 30 and 45.
Okay.
That's it. Sine of
Sweet, thank.
29 degrees, I go to my calculator, always, 100% of the time.
Okay.
All right,
Well,
I will let you go.
well, I'll probably talk to you next week too, because I'll probably have more stuff for you.
Okay, that's good, but every single trig student needs to get through this unit circle section because you
Yeah.
really can't go much further in trig without being able to know what these common angle trig functions are.
Yeah. All right.
I'll talk to you next time, Peyton.
Yeah, I'll see you. Bye. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.